In this video, I'm going to tell you exactly how I stopped looking at pornography permanently. I struggled with porn throughout my teenage years. I hated it and I loved it at the same time. I loved it while I was doing it, but afterwards it left me feeling so hollow and filthy and guilty. I had believed in Jesus since a pretty young age, and I knew what I was doing was wrong, but I lacked the ability to fix myself. I had repented and asked God to forgive me many times. I meant it every time, and I know He forgave me each time. But I kept falling back into my sin. Whenever the temptation would arise, I simply could not stop myself. There were some periods of time when I managed to stay away from it for a while, but it never lasted. Then, when I was 19 years old, I got my first grown-up job, and I could finally afford to move out and rent my own apartment, which was amazing in a lot of ways, but it certainly didn't help with my porn problem, which soon became an addiction. There I was, living by myself, 19 years old, with a laptop and unlimited access to the internet. I spent a lot of lonely nights in that place, drowning in my lust. I had always been tempted to believe that my porn habit, although certainly not a good thing, couldn't possibly pose a serious threat to my salvation. For years, I had entertained some murky theology, which enabled me to soothe my aching conscience. More on that in a different video, probably. Thankfully, in His mercy, God didn't allow me to become totally complacent. The more I sinned, the more worried I became, murky theology notwithstanding, until I finally reached a breaking point. I remember that night vividly. As usual, I had followed my whims across the worst parts of the internet and was now riddled with guilt and self-loathing. It wasn't unusual for me to start praying at this point in the night, begging God to forgive me and to change me. But I think there might have been something different about the way I prayed that night. I was more desperate than I'd ever been before, and more afraid. The direness of God's warnings to the sexually immoral had begun to crystallize in my mind. More than anything else, I was keenly aware of my own helplessness. I knew beyond a shadow of doubt that I was utterly incapable of extracting myself from this mess. I had tried to quit so many times before, and I was deathly afraid of what would happen to me if I didn't. And so I prayed, probably more fervently than I ever had before. Nothing happened. Eventually I went to bed with the usual mixed feelings. I felt relief because I truly believed that God had forgiven me. But I also felt exasperation because, based on my track record, I knew I was probably going to do it all again the next day. Now here's the cool part. About 3 weeks later, I had a sudden realization. It occurred to me that pornography hadn't crossed my mind once since that night. I had been going about my business, going to work, coming home, doing things on the internet, and I hadn't even thought about it once that entire time. This was unprecedented for me. Needless to say, I was surprised and delighted. But the best part was when I discovered that I was actually a changed man with new power. I now had the power to say no to this particular temptation. What had been essentially impossible for me before was now remarkably easy. Make no mistake, I still get tempted. It's not like I stopped thinking women are beautiful. But now, when the temptation to lust rears its head, I stop and think, I know what's down that road, and I don't want it. So I just dismiss it, and that's it. I couldn't do that before. God literally changed me in an instant. It was a miracle. So here's what I would say to anyone who's struggling with pornography or with any other sin. I am not special. God didn't do this miracle for me because of anything special in me. I am just another regular Christian saved by the grace of God. And if He can do it for me, He can do it for you. But you have to seek Him with all your heart. Fill up your mind with Scripture. Surround yourself with people who are serious about obeying God. Learn to hate the things that God hates. When you mess up and feel guilty, don't try to comfort yourself. Let that guilt drive you to your knees. Don't become complacent in your sin. Fear God and never stop praying for Him to change you. He can, and He will.